Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are joining. Welcome to our Cloud Lunch and Learn session today. We are going to have a very important topic today with one of the very well-known person in the community, in the cloud community, with Tim Warner. Probably you watch some of his video courses and you are well aware about all he does. So let me welcome him to the studio.
Thank you. So glad to be here with everybody.
Hi, Tim. Welcome to the studio. How are you doing?
I'm chipper. I'm chipper. It's 7:04 here in Nashville, Tennessee, so the sun's not quite up, but I am. How
Great,
are
yeah.
you doing?
Great you hear from East Coast. So it's coming
hmm
to 8 here, 8:04
Mm,
a.m. But
hmm
yeah, I'm doing great. I lost a little bit of my voice because of this
hmm
seasonal allergy and stuff like that. I hope
hmm
you don't get the same kind of allergy stuff on the springtime in the region where you are.
Well, sadly, the way it is in Nashville, Tennessee is that you move here without allergies, and within a few years you have allergies. I've been here 23 years, so my whole family has them.
Oh man, that's a little bit painful, but it's good saying that we find a way to fight it, right? There's like some medication and stuff like that, so we are not
Mhm.
totally helpless. All right, great. Coming back to our topic today, GitHub Actions and how to get started with them. Before going there, I actually want to say thank you for your contributions in the community. Way back,
You're
maybe four
welcome.
or 5 years ago, when I was starting with Mike Pfeiffer, you were there, with the audience, kind of doing some basically open and free of charge consultation and as well as demonstrations, adding your contributions to those. So I want to say thank you for being so long, and I know that you have been a long MVP before switching, becoming Microsoft full-time employee, and then now back again
Mm.
MVP. So congratulations on getting into that MVP family, and we are really glad to have you in the studio.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here as well. And let's see, to confirm, you can see my slide deck okay? Yeah.
Yes, we see it. So floor is all yours. Thank you, and I'll be behind the scene. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, formally, welcome everybody to GitHub Actions Quick Start. We're going to spend about an hour together, I guess. And I've got the comments over on another monitor. So as questions come in, I'm happy to answer them. Please let me know those questions. There's no slide deck here because GitHub Actions, by its very nature, is just eminently practical. So all I want to do is here give you where the session materials are, such as they are. timw.info/actions is the short URL. But if for whatever reason you're in a spot where you can't resolve short links, it's just a GitHub public repo that I'll go to right now and show you. The full URL is github.com/Timothy Warner/actions cert prep. And there's really not a lot in here, basically. Like I said, there's no slide deck. The main value I think that this repository has for you is the README file itself, where I've got contact info if you want to stay in touch after the session. I've got a rundown of just the core setup for VS Code in GitHub Actions if you're interested. And then some additional links that I think are useful, including some free training links from Microsoft Learn. And I'm happy to talk to you about GitHub certifications if you're interested in that. GitHub had 3 certifications for a number of years, but they were just open for their partner ecosystem. You probably know that recently GitHub announced at least those 3. There's GitHub Foundations, GitHub Actions, GitHub Advanced Security, and I'm sure there's at least another one I'm missing. It's interesting the way they work. GitHub being owned by Microsoft, but GitHub marches to the beat of their own drummer. They've got a lot of autonomy. And you can see that once you start looking at their generative AI services. Anyway, we're here about GitHub Actions. First of all, what the heck is GitHub Actions and why do we care? Well, GitHub Actions is GitHub's CI/CD engine, continuous integration, continuous delivery. It's to automate anything you want to not do manually. Most commonly, it's testing your software, building, compiling your software if need be, setting up the environment, making sure that you do your unit tests and integration tests and security tests. Try to shift as much of that testing as early in the build process as possible. And if there's a break, the idea in DevOps is that you've got a short feedback loop back to the developer where they can fix the problem, resubmit it, and rinse and repeat over and over and over again. And I figure we'll operate on this very repository, believe it or not, because again, the thing with Actions is that it's not strictly speaking for software building and delivery. It's absolutely great for that. Not just the building and testing of your solution, but also your deployment and ongoing configuration management of wherever the solution is. Azure, local data center, another cloud, it doesn't matter a bit. So how does it work? Well, GitHub Actions have to live. They're called workflows, actually. There's some fine points about the vocabulary. Let me open up another browser tab for you and go to what's called the GitHub Marketplace. And in that marketplace, it's divided into apps and actions. We're concerned with actions right now. And this is an enormous library that's similar in concept to to the Visual Studio Marketplace or PyPy or NPM. It's sort of like that. Of course, every project here, every action is a GitHub repo in itself. And you can actually, if you decide to go the route of developing your own actions and you do want to share with the community, I would recommend you look into that because you can not only publish to the GitHub Marketplace, but you can also become a verified creator. You see, the standard rules apply. You want to look for in the actions list, there's lots of different sort options here, and it defaults to the most installed, of course. And what you'll find here is that there's a lot of community individuals and groups, a lot of businesses and independent software vendors, hardware vendors, IT vendors. To look at these, it's overwhelming at first. I think that you should look at the ones that are by GitHub. Some you'll use literally every workflow you do, like checkout, for example. And all of these actions are nothing more than automation scripts that were written either in JavaScript or in another stack using Docker. You see, it's important as a theme to remember that GitHub, the entire GitHub is a JavaScript ecosystem. So creating an action is eminently possible. You'll have the best experience if you use JavaScript. If you use another stack, you have to do Docker containers. But ultimately, an action is simply an automation script that does some kind of action. Checkout is critical because this is what allows your cloud runners, the virtual machines that are running in presumably the Azure cloud as virtual machines. They need to be able to grab your repository at the correct branch or commit SHA, whatever it is that you're hinging your workflow on, needs to be able to grab the code at that point and pull it down, clone it down to its file system and check out the appropriate branch or SHA. You see what I mean? So checkout is one that you use every single time. And some things that you'll notice is that the maintainers, of course, hopefully are regularly updating their actions. You can pin your actions to an earlier version if the developers make a change that breaks your workflows. So it's easy to do that kind of stuff. Again, you want to look at reputation. You can look for verified creators, look for good reviews. And ultimately, it all boils down to yet another markup language, or YAML, all right? If you're going to learn any technical skill with GitHub Actions, it's going to be YAML, which is a data serialization format. It's not a programming language. So with YAML, you might know this. It's like JSON in terms of it's a great way to represent data in a compact way. But unlike JSON, YAML is really strict when it comes to indenting and line returns and stuff like that. No tabs. You want to be really consistent. You don't have to indent 2 characters, although that's the standard. You just want to be consistent so that whatever is parsing your YAML understands the hierarchy of your file. See, what these actions do, they're automation scripts that in most cases are doing pretty basic things. Like this one, as you can see, is going to be doing a bunch of bash commands to ultimately get, clone and pull down your machine. So I want you to think of an automation workflow as just one or more of these action steps that you stitch together. And it's just running these scripts over and over and over and over and over again. You're probably wondering, well, how much does this cost? GitHub Actions pricing. I give you, as I said, some links in that repository, and that it's a living repo. Every time I teach the subject, I wind up adding to it. So I'm going to make a note right now on my other monitor. Add more links to Cloud Lunch and Learn links list. And to go back there for a second, that README that I was telling you about, in the top of the file under my contact information. This is not an advertisement. I'm not a salesperson. It's pretty much the last career I would ever pick in my life. But I completed a video course for Microsoft Press on GitHub Actions. It's about 5-6 hours of training. So if you have access to LinkedIn Learning, or used to be Safari, now it's called O'Reilly Live Learning. If you have a membership there, you can get access with your subscription. But that, I have a much more robust opportunity to stretch out. And actually, it mentions Cert Prep in the title. I cover every single objective on the GitHub Action certification exam. So keep this product in the back of your mind if you do have GitHub Action certification at all on your on your mind. Now with GitHub Actions, the main thing you're paying for is the what are called GitHub hosted runners, the actual cloud machines that are doing your work. Hopefully it makes sense. That's the whole idea of the public cloud, isn't it? You're paying for the consumption, that is the compute that you're burning up on the provider side. And the way it works, depending on whether you're using the free or the pro or the enterprise license with GitHub, you're always going to have a free limit of a certain number of minutes runtime. You can see it right here. And that's one of the things you're charged for, and one of the things that you'll want to monitor over time and make sure that you're watching your repos and looking at those workflow runs. You can actually do that at a higher level of abstraction. I know we're going to do all demo in just a second, I promise. I just want to get through this initial bit of theory. So monitoring is critical so that you're not running workflows and burning up minutes when you don't want to, when it's a forgotten about project, but maybe you've got a scheduled trigger, so it's still running. You want to keep in mind that kind of stuff. The other thing you pay for is the storage. What does that mean? Well, these are going to be particularly the persistent artifacts that you cache. See, one of the things that you can do with your GitHub workflows is that you can cache particularly your dependencies, your software dependencies, but anything else that your runners are going to need to download again and again and again and again, you can actually cache that in the GitHub CDN, or Content Delivery Network. And the benefit there, of course, is that especially with a busy workflow that's getting run several times a day, you're saving a lot of money, and the storage is going up because of the cache, but you're definitely saving money in terms of just additional time and effort and bandwidth in terms of downloading those assets. You don't have to have cloud hosted runners. That's another thing. Okay, enough of this. Let's get into the situation. I figured we would go first, dive right into the creation process and kick the tires with that loop, what I call the debug loop. And then we can take a step back and look at the management and governance of actions, and we can look at how to configure actions behavior both at the repository and at the organization level. How's that sound? Let me see if anybody's got a question yet. Rick is saying, my company is looking to combine our tool sets. Currently, we heavily use TeamCity and Octopus Deploy. Yeah, oh yeah, sure. What I would encourage you to do, Rick, again, is to go back into the marketplace and look at your vendors and look at your current stack. I mean, GitHub historically has been built on the model where you're using GitHub as your code base and you're using other SaaS products or your own hosted stuff for everything else. What we're seeing from a macro perspective at Microsoft, since Microsoft bought GitHub, is that they're faced with an issue. They've got Azure DevOps, which has been their own CI/CD and software development lifecycle stack, and then they buy GitHub. So there's some tension there, isn't there? Actually, there's really not, believe it or not. I say this having been inside at Microsoft, at least from my perspective there. No, it's a question that GitHub is gradually coming into feature parity with Azure DevOps. You can do package management in GitHub now. You can do project management. So eventually there'll be feature parity and beyond with GitHub, at which time I think we can expect to see Azure DevOps slowly and slowly go away. It'll be years. Microsoft uses Azure DevOps very heavily internally. So, I mean, they would need to migrate themselves in addition to giving their customers help. Okay, here's what we're going to do with this repository. This README consists of a bunch of links, right? And let's say that I teach this fairly regularly and I update the links every so often, but wouldn't it be nice to automate a links check so that, before I do a presentation, all the links in my README work, especially since I use that as a links list for my participants. So that's an example of how we can automate all of the things with GitHub Actions. Let me show you what we do. So in the repository, you head on over to Actions from the code page, and you don't have to do it this way. Again, normally there's several ways to do it, but this is going through the GitHub web UI. And this is taking us directly to a page that at first blush looks pretty overwhelming and confusing. It was to me at first. This is the Actions page, and there's an Actions page for every public, internal, or private GitHub repo. You can use it or you can ignore it. It's totally up to you. It shows any workflows that are currently in the correct location, and the correct location, you need to know this, is .github. You need a hidden .github folder in the root of your repository. In .github, you create a subfolder called workflows. And in that subdirectory is where you put your YAML files. Doesn't matter whether you use YAML or YML. I tend to use YML myself, being an old MS-DOS and Solaris guy from a long, long time ago. So once you're there, that's where the files actually go. And this allows us to view and inspect and edit and work with any workflows that we've currently got attached to the repo. And notice that when you select one of these workflows, depending on its status, in this case, I'm manually disabled. So as you can see, one way to address that issue I mentioned before, where you don't want your workflow popping off too much or whatever, you can always come into your list here and then open, let me go back one, open the workflows little ellipsis menu here. And well, that allows me to delete. Up here, yeah, it looks like on the workflow status page, the run history page, this guy up here, there's lots of those little more icons, those more buttons in GitHub where you get the little ellipsis. You can do one of those build badges, those status badges, so you can generate these for each of your workflows. So that's a convenient way if you post that on your README where everybody can see if your workflow is broken or if it's working, you see. And notice also, you always want to think about what branch you're doing your automation on. It doesn't have to be your main branch. It can be any branch. It's something that you specify. Now notice there's a new workflow. We'll take a look at that in a second. If we scroll down, we've got management. So this is where we can see if there's any caching going on, as I mentioned before. And again, this is a great thing to know about, particularly so that you don't have your cloud runners or your self-hosted runners for sure. You don't have them re-downloading dependencies over and over and over and over again. It's going to give you much, much better execution times. Deployments, what's that going to click out to do? Whoops, that's going to show any, any deployments that it's done. And I've got a bunch of failures. You know, something to be totally candid, I forgot exactly what that does. The runners allows you to inspect how you've configured runners. And again, these are simply the machines that are doing the work for you. So instead of you sitting at your development workstation, doing all these tests and everything and deployment and whatever, the runners are doing it. And here I want you to know that your choice is to use GitHub hosted runners, which come in a variety of profiles. I would definitely have you hinge your learning at the GitHub Actions docs. Docs.github.com is a really nicely tended doc set. It really is. They do a pretty good job of setting it up here. And I've got a link to that and some free Microsoft Learn tutorials on the README and the course repo. All right. Let me get rid of these two. We were looking at our runners list. Yeah, they come in, as you can see here, Windows, Linux, and Mac. And that's, I believe, I wouldn't tell you anything that's protected with a non-disclosure agreement, but what I've heard publicly mentioned by GitHub engineers is that they're using the same Azure VMs that Azure DevOps uses, which of course makes all the sense in the world. And, depending on your environment, if you're building Mac software for iOS or for Mac OS, you know how Apple is. You've got to have their hardware. You've got to use Xcode. They make you do all their stuff. Fortunately, both Azure DevOps and GitHub have you covered, and you can attach to Mac-based runners. Now, the self-hosted is going to be number one, the main thing, if the built-in software on the GitHub hosted runners doesn't match your specs and you're not able to work around that, you can have the runner install extra stuff. You do all of this stuff in your workflow. It all comes down to YAML in a declarative plain text workflow where you specify everything that you want to do in the order that you want to do it. Okay. Now, self-hosted runners involves you installing an agent on a remote Windows, Mac OS, or Linux machine that could be anywhere in the world. The agent's going to communicate over TCP 443, so you should be able to get through all firewalls. And other than that, the self-hosted runners are considered just like a GitHub hosted runner. You specify your runner group in your workflow file, and you're either grinding the gears on using your stuff, or you're paying for a GitHub hosted runner. Different cases for different scenarios. Privacy and confidentiality is another reason for self-hosted runners. You can scope these and customize these however you want. And if you're a GitHub administrator, you're probably thinking, well, can I govern this at the org level? And absolutely, you can govern all of this stuff from a higher level once, and then have your configuration go down to the repos that are all owned by your organization. One other point about that with GitHub organizations and centralized governance is one technique you can think about is creating a central repository to host your workflows. So if I go, for instance, to my organization scope and take a look at my repos, if I can remember how to how to enumerate those. Yeah, right up here. So if I look at my repo list, what was I going to look at in here? I hate when my brain it just turns off every once in a while. It's sort of a chaos engineering thing where your brain just dumps. Yeah, I was having us look at the centralized repository. Yeah, the pattern here is at the org level, you create a repo. The convention is to name the repo .github. And there's some other stuff. You can read about this in the GitHub Actions docs, but the pattern here is that you and your team can centralize your workflow templates in a shared organizational level repo. And then you can call those workflows from any repo underneath your org just by calling its owner/repo and then the path to where the YAML file is. So that's something else just as a pattern to think about. But like I said, enough of this stuff. Let's see if I can get back to our original action cert prep repo. And let's go to the actions blade and let's see if there's a template that might suit our use case of doing a README links checker. I honestly don't know if there is, so this is going to be new for me too. We'll go to new workflow, and this just taps us. It's another interface into the GitHub Marketplace, which we looked at earlier over here. It's just a subset, though, suggested for this repo. These are just 80% scenarios that a lot of GitHub customers do, given the prevalence of these development stacks, okay? The deployment deals, as you can see, predominantly with various cloud deployments where you're going to use a declarative template. Like in Azure, you'd be using a bicep template or a JSON template. Same Amazon, a YAML template or a JSON template. And we're keeping that infrastructure as code. So we're really, by diving into workflows, it's a great way to have an excuse to dive deeper into DevOps principles. Infrastructure as code, complete change history, and this sort of stuff. Well, I'm not seeing anything that's really helping. We can search. What if I do a links check and see if we can get anything back? How about I know this is a Mickey Mouse example. I'm sure why there's not any built-in workflows in there. So we can always skip this, and instead of using a template, you can just create a brand new workflow from scratch. And when you're using the web UI, notice that it will helpfully place the file in the correct location. And if you haven't yet created the .github workflows directory structure, GitHub is happy to create it for you here. You can create it yourself. For instance, if you're working locally in your development environment, it's just literally a directory with .github as its name. There's nothing extra special or magical or whatever about it. Now you can see here, this is, again, just a web editor. You don't have to use this, but it shows us using the standard 2-space indentation. This is wrapping or not. So it's a basic editor. You can show or hide what's called the help panel. And this is really nicely made because on one hand, it makes it really easy to get to actions. And number two, it gives you a link to the docs. And another thing that's cool about this interface that I like is that when you find an action that you're interested in, or you definitely know you want that action, you can copy and then paste the YAML stub and then just shred it out, get rid of the comments. I mean, comments, frankly, let's face it, are a good best practice anyway. So you may not want to shred the comments. The owner of the action, and the action is the automation script that we incorporate into our workflows. GitHub Actions with an uppercase refers to this whole pattern of CI, CD, and GitHub. Actions with a lowercase refer to those scripts. You can build your own. You don't have to post those scripts to the GitHub Marketplace. Totally cool to keep everything internal and private. Same exact workflow, pun intended, okay? So the development loop here, if we're using the browser, is that we're building out our file, and you're going to just commit and go from there. Now, why don't I start typing? Is there IntelliSense? No, I don't like this editor, to be honest. I'm a VS Code person through and through. I'm hugely obsessed with this application. And I've got the same repo cloned down here, as you can see. Let me zoom in a little bit more. And what I'm actually going to do, it just occurred to me. Let me go into the workflows folder, and I'm going to actually ask my friend GitHub Copilot. I'm going to say GitHub workflow that showcases for educational purposes different elements like various triggers, matrix definition, CI and CD, etc. Be creative. As you can see, I have a very informal relationship with Gen AI. It's actually getting to be a little scary sometimes, to the point where I sometimes feel like I'm interacting with an AI almost as if it's a sentient being. Fun fact, there's a movie with Joaquin Phoenix called Her. Do you remember that? From at least 10 years ago. And it's interesting to watch that now, given what's happened with virtual assistants and AI assistants. So check out that movie if you haven't yet. All right, well, I'm going to just grab this file and throw it into a new file. And let's just take a look at this example. Now, how do I have VS Code set up for maximum comfort when developing actions? You're going to want to have some key extensions here. Most of them are from GitHub. GitHub makes some great VS Code extensions. The main ones we're interested in here are, well, of course, there's GitHub Actions. You need that. And that's going to give us IntelliSense, code completion, and help in the editor when it is aware that we're working with not just a standard YAML file, but with a GitHub Actions file. Some other GitHub, well, there's a lot, actually. I would look at the official GitHub ones specifically. The GitHub pull requests is I think, an essential GitHub extension. Of course, I like the Copilot, but Actions, and the other one you'll want is Red Hat's official YAML extension. I remember when I first saw this extension, I thought, why is Red Hat squatting on this official extension? It's not that. Red Hat owns Ansible, and they're committers to all sorts of open source projects. So it's cool, I guess, that Red Hat owns this extension. It's good. It gives us what we need for YAML validation. Anyway, let's take a look here, and I want to make sure you understand everything that's going on in a typical workflow. First, we've got the name, and this is what shows up in the GitHub interface and in console outputs whenever you're referencing the workflow name. Notice that the name is not the same as the file name. I mean, you can make them the same or similar, but they're different properties. Workflows are always run on the basis of a trigger. So we have an on clause here where you decide what events will trip off this workflow. The most common ones by far are push and pull request. Push is going to be associated with one or more branches. This one is using master. I'm going to actually use main instead. Alt clicking, by the way, is going to give you multiple cursors. So in this case, whenever I push code into main, that's going to trip off the workflow. Now, what if I create a feature branch and I push the branch to create a pull request? That still would count as a push. What was confusing to me for a little while is differentiating pull and pull request, because pull request, anytime there's a pull request action, when a pull request is open, updated, commented on, anything that happens within the context of a pull request workflow, those events will trigger a pull request workflow run as long as it hits the appropriate branch or branches. Now, the confusion potentially is the overlap. If you're doing a push that's attached to a pull request, then I think GitHub will just run one of the two, but you very well could have multiple running, unfortunately. And actually, if any of you have a good solution to that, I just recently that popped that notion, that conflict where I know I've got some workflows running too much, because if my push has a pull request, there's the push trigger and then there's opening the pull request. However, updating a pull request when you're adding additional commits, there's another question. Those additional commits, are those considered pushes? It's a little bit fuzzy, to be totally honest. It really depends. Are you doing a push or not? If it's just a pull request, you're closing a pull request and there's no push, then it would only be the pull request event that goes. You see what I'm saying? Best practice. Maybe you want to go just for one or the other. And remember that you can have multiple workflows. There's no need to create a huge monolithic workflow that does everything. More efficient, it seems to me, is to, and similar to the metaphor of the microservices architecture, have tidier atomic workflows that do something and do something really well. You can call workflows from other workflows. There's lots and lots and whole bunches of flexibility here. Now, schedule is using a cron expression. Nothing more to it than that. Now, what's not in this example that I'm going to add is workflow dispatch. Now, that's GitHub Copilot trying to fill in the blanks there. Workflow dispatch is where you want the option. I think I need to indent that. You want the option to manually run your trigger. That option uses the workflow dispatch, and that allows you to either programmatically trip off the trigger, or when you're in the GitHub UI, you can just say run. So that is the clause that determines the event or events that will automatically trip off the workflow. Next, you've got your jobs list. And here, you're going to have one or more jobs, each of which has its own metadata, for lack of a better term. Specifically, where are you running? Now, again, the GitHub docs are where you can get all the short names. I should be able to get, actually, this is good that I'm noticing this, because you can see I'm not getting any syntax help. GitHub Copilot is helping, and I'm not getting any coloration. And if I look down in the lower right, see how it says no JSON schema? I immediately can see what my problem is. I need to save this file. I'm going to save it in the .github workflows folder, and I'll just call this CLL for Cloud Lunch and Learn .yml. And once that happens, you probably know this, the way GitHub the way VS Code works by default is on file type. And if you have the GitHub Actions extension loaded and it's a YML file, hopefully the language mode will show up, and you can always override that if auto detect doesn't work. But now we should find that we get syntax highlighting. So runs on, for instance, if we put in a space. I'm waiting. I could try Alt space to try to force the IntelliSense. It's still not doing it. Unfortunately, I find that some extensions are faster than others. Runs on Ubuntu latest. So whatever the latest version and build of Ubuntu is, and again, I'll punt you into the docs for info on what software is installed on the cloud runners by default. Now, strategy is not something you have to do, but a matrix strategy allows you to fan out your actions. Let's say you're building a node application that you need to test on 3 different versions of MySQL. So you can create an array here using a matrix strategy. Again, it's going to take you into the GitHub Actions docs to figure out the appropriate syntax and everything. But this one is using node version, and then our array is specifying 3 different versions of nodes. And then within the job definition here, this is a single job definition that normally would be handled by a single runner. When you're doing a matrix strategy, you can start to patch in those matrix elements, as you can see here. When you're setting up the project and building and so on, you can layer in those matrix elements. And what that would do in this example, let me go back up to where it was here on line 15. This instructs the GitHub cloud hosted runners. We don't need 1 Ubuntu latest cloud runner. We need 3. So in parallel, those 3 machines, one is going to do 12.x, one's going to do 14, one's going to do 16. Isn't that convenient? So that is the unlock with matrix strategy. Within a job, once you've determined where your runners are, or if you're going to do a fan out pattern, then it's the actual steps. And each one of these is going to have a little collection of attributes where we, at the very least, have a uses element where we reference an action. Again, it's going to be maintainer /action and then @version number. And a nice thing about the GitHub Actions extension is that you can control-click these to go to the Actions GitHub repo to read more about it, which is kind of cool. So here, when the cloud-hosted runner goes to fetch the code and bring it down and switch to the correct branch, we're also going to involve, in this case, 1 run using node 11 or whatever you see. So there's actually an object namespace. You know how there's the document object model for JavaScript and web pages where you've got standard names for each page element? There's a similar object model within all of GitHub, actually, but specifically within Actions, there's a whole collection of objects that you can attach to. And this would be where you can start to get into secrets. We could cover so much. I know that this is just a high-level overview. But in this case, it's just doing garden variety node building, where a lot of times your tasks may be nothing more than a run statement where you're executing a PowerShell command or a GitHub CLI command or a Docker command. Again, it's pretty low to the ground. It's just stitching together scripts one after the other. This one has a deploy step, it looks like. I don't know. This was just one auto created for us. There's no debugging as such with these workflows. The loop, if you want to call it that, is simply adding a workflow, editing a workflow, committing the change. Here I'm watching for main, and I'm currently on the main branch. So I'm just going to say add demo workflow. I'm going to push this up onto the main branch, and we should be able to jump over to our repo and head over to Actions. So the iterative development and testing process for your actions, for me anyway, is just going back and forth between them. Now, VS Code runs in the cloud as well, so I really don't even need to use a browser. But it's just a question of tweaking, push, check the workflow run. Okay, got some problems, fix and iterate. That's the loop we're talking about. And when you've got a lot of workflows, this master list makes my eyes cross. So you can come over here and choose which one you want to look at. And this is where the name comes in. I actually forgot what ours is called, Node.js CI/CD. So let's go to Node.js CI/CD. Tells us this workflow has a workflow dispatch. So that's how you do the manual invocation. If you've got, let's say you've got your release set as a workflow dispatch. So when you're ready to publish a new release, that's generally not something you're going to want to do automatically. So you could set that release workflow to workflow dispatch, and then you can go from there. Now, there's another whole parallel set of things that we could do in terms of branch protection, where you can force pull requests and so on, and that interrelates with workflows. But ultimately, it comes down to, did the workflow succeed or fail? In my case, of course, it failed. Gives us a little bit of metadata over on the side. We can view the underlying workflow file, or we could click it up here. But going into the actual run allows us to access the logs. First of all, it gives us just a visual display here where you can see at what phase. This was a two-phase workflow that had build and release baked into it at once. And all three of the matrix jobs failed, and we can look at each one individually. And you can learn a lot here by looking at the log inspector. It breaks it out into phases where you can see step by step when it attaches to a runner, when it finds the runner, and you can literally see as it does its work. And again, it's just running terminal command after terminal command. It looks like our failure, what we're most interested in, is where the X is. And this is where we can get, this looks like the root of the problem. And again, what I do, especially now that Gen AI is so helpful, is that I'll just grab a relevant snag of the console output and throw it into Gen AI and say, help. And that's especially useful when you're in GitHub Copilot, or when I keep calling VS Code GitHub Copilot. But when you're in your VS or whatever your editor is, it's nice to have that as a long-running dialogue, okay? So there it is. Let me see. Anything else off the quick top of my head? I would suggest that you play around with Gen AI, free Gen AI, Google Gemini free, ChatGPT free, GitHub Copilot free. If for no other reason, you can test some of these patterns. Like another example might be GitHub workflow that involves repository secrets. That's something that we definitely need to discuss. And let's see, there was something else I wanted this to highlight. And configures, no. Let's see. Example, GitHub workflow that involves repository secrets, and there was something else. Hang on just a second. Just can't remember. Oh well, we can always add to it. But let me show you how we can solve the problem of never exposing an API key, a software license key, a password, personally identifiable information, whatever. So it looks like Copilot assumes that I'm working on the same script, so it's giving me the same basic workflow. Is it not finished generating yet here? There we go. I want to get that code over into the right-hand side. There we go. Let's see what we got here. Okay, it's on the very last side. I found that the secret sauce for handling, pun intended, the secret sauce to handling secrets in your workflow is to use repo or organization level secrets and call them using that aforementioned object model in GitHub. The namespace is called secrets, easily enough. And believe it or not, it's the same tag, it's the same element, whether you're pulling a secret from your repository or if you have a shared secret that's at the org level, you still just address it in your code using this JavaScript-like interpolation syntax where you do $double curlies. You don't need to have a leading and trailing space, but that appears to be a convention in the community. And we'll just do secrets.secret name, and that's all you have to do it. You might wonder, how in the world does GitHub know, or how does it resolve permissions? Well, it's a complex question overall, but specifically there's a built-in reserved object. I think it's called GitHub _token. It represents GitHub itself. And you can just have GitHub fetch your secrets and anything that you can grab within the GitHub ecosystem. I've been fine just letting the default permissions ride where GitHub uses its identity. And you can call that identity. I keep forgetting what it's called. Let's go back to GitHub Copilot one more time. Add code in which we invoke the GitHub security context to access something in GitHub. I know that seems kind of vague, but hopefully the AI will understand what I'm trying to get at and regenerate some code. Notice in your jobs, you can create an env block, and this gives you control over environment variables on your runner. So the pattern is to put your secrets into environment variables that will be injected into the RAM of your cloud-hosted runner. So that would solve the runner having everything it needs in terms of access if it's calling an API, no matter what it is. GitHub token, that's what I was trying to think about. That's a reasonable enough name. So let me bring this code back over here again. Looks like there's something messed up with it. Look at all that red. But down at the bottom, we can see GitHub token, secrets.github_token. That's not an item that shows up in your repository. It's just an invisible identity. It's sort of like in Windows, you've got the everyone identity, the network service identity, all that kind of stuff. Well, let's take a look at what this looks like in the repo and at the org level. At the repo level, we can go over to, trying to remember, not on security. No, it's secrets. Actually, hang on a second. Secrets and variables. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so repo settings, secrets and variables under security, actions. There we go. And we can create not only secrets in our repo, but we can also create environment variables. That's what environment secrets are. There's lots of ways that you can work with envs in workflows. This is just one easy way to do it, where you can create these environment variables and populate them into your runners at the repo level, you see. So if I create a new repo secret here, it's going to be usable only within this repo. But if we go upstairs to the organizational settings level, let's go into the org settings. And if we go down to secrets and variables, actions. This is where we can do a bird's eye perspective, and we can create secrets and environment variables that are accessible using the secrets object anywhere, any place in your workflows. Very convenient. It really is very convenient indeed to work with it that way. And, you know, going further, if you're worried about key exposure, if you're worried about a developer pushing a known API key, let's say they're working with OpenAI models and they do an OpenAI API key. I'm trying to think what GitHub will help you out of box with that. They'll give you some basic protection, but GitHub Advanced Security is where you get into secret scanning. And that's going to not only detect when an API key is showing up in source code, it can actually prevent your developers from doing a push if their change set includes a known identified API key. It's called secret scanning. And you configure that, again, at the repo, org, and enterprise settings. Question in the queue from Sadesh, is GitHub Copilot free? Yeah, you can sign up for a free trial. It's like 30 or 60 days. I'm pretty sure the subscription does auto convert, so be careful about that. You can find GitHub Copilot anywhere. Just do a Google search or go to github.com to sign up. And if you go into your user settings at github.com, you can come down to billing and plans and usage, and that's where you can verify GitHub Copilot. It shows up as an add-on to your account. And the free trial, there's not a free version, but the free trial, I think, auto-converts, so you want to be careful. And if you convert it, it's going to be per user per month. There's the GitHub Copilot Pro, the individual tier, and there's, Microsoft loves to name, rename, and diversify. I have GitHub Copilot Enterprise, which is, of course, the most expensive stock keeping unit. That one, you have to have a GitHub Enterprise Cloud account, and it's the most expensive. It's like 30 or 40 bucks per user per month. But the GitHub Copilot Enterprise is what's going to allow you to create custom GPTs, which is what everybody, including myself, wants. Yes, Rick, I would absolutely say, and I have to say, I'm somewhat embarrassed that I'm late to the party with GitHub. I mean, I used it daily for a long time, but it was one of those cases, and tell me if you can relate, where it's one of those things where one of these days I'm going to really buckle down and get smart on GitHub. But right now, I have these fires to put out. So I'm going to just clicky clack and get from point A to point B and leave the rest. Well, fortunately, I'm over that hump. It's remarkably easy to govern your repos and govern your workflows. Just create an organization. There's no charge to having an org. And once you have an org, you then can own multiple individual repos and govern them. Even as an individual, it makes a lot of sense to me for you to have an org. I'm just saying that, giving you my lesson. Yeah, and definitely the idea with organization is those shareable internal workflows. If you're not using public workflows, that's definitely a really big deal. Let me go back to the course repo one more time. So it's timw.info/actions. And let's go and look at the workflows I have again. Let's go to actions and let me look at a previous workflow. This one, it looks like it's disabled. It's just been broken since the very beginning. That's not cool. Do I have any of these that actually do real work? Oh my Lord, I don't think so. Well, what were we doing? I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I've got to complete this. Let's go back to our original environment here, same repo. And let's create that links list. And I'm gonna have our friend create it in the interest of time. GitHub action that scans all links in the repos. What is it? readme.md reports on broken links. Runs manually. And in the meantime, I'm going to create one more workflow that I'm going to call links.yml. And we'll just okay, so it looks like GitHub is relying on a third-party action here. So whether that works or not is going to be another question. So let's take a quick look, first of all. Check links, manual. We're going to do an Ubuntu latest. We're going to check out the code on the correct branch, and then we're going to invoke Lychee versus Lychee action v108. Now, is that the most recent version? Maybe or maybe not. I found that sometimes GitHub Copilot, well, a little bit more than sometimes, will reference older packages and that sort of thing. It looks like the latest release is 193, actually. So I'm going to update the version. So the point here is trust but verify with Gen AI. Sorry if I'm going overboard with Gen AI. You might be like, I'm not here for Gen AI, and I appreciate that. Let me quickly post this. I'm going to use Gen AI to create a commit message. Whoops. And let's see if that thing runs. Hopefully we'll get one workflow that runs correctly. Excuse me. So I'm going to run this manually via workflow dispatch. And in a moment, we should see a job start spinning up. There we go. And we can watch it as it's happening live here. Well, that was fast. Wow. I mean, that's really fast. Look at this. Now, the output that you get in a console, all of this is up to the actions author. And let me leave you with that because we're at the top of the hour. Go to the GitHub Marketplace, do keyword searches for things that you're interested in automating, see what others have done, see if you can use their action in place. If not, there's no harm in you forking, cloning, and customizing an action. That's the idea. These are all in public open source repos. And there's nothing wrong with you forking one of those public repos, bringing it private, tweaking it, and then using it internally. It's all part of open source development. Let me see. Any other questions? Let me go back to StreamYard here. Okay, so Rick, you're all in Bitbucket. You know, that's a thing, isn't it, with GitHub? Because GitHub, and this is purely my own opinion and speculation, as I said, but GitHub appears to unfortunately have aspects of Apple and LinkedIn in my observation, and that is those companies kind of act like competitors don't exist, and it's their walled garden, and you're going to happily live blissfully and forever, prancing around in their walled garden as long as you got money. So what does that have to do with this? Well, the fact that GitHub, it's not a walled garden, but it can be opinionated in spots. Anyway, there's my contact deets up there. The courses, my Pluralsight courses, I created a short link, timw.info. PS, if you want to connect, you can either find me on LinkedIn or my work email is tim-warner@pluralsight.com. What else do you have? Any other questions in closing? Otherwise, I'll leave you to it.
So thank you, team, for providing this session. There was good communication and set of good questions that came. So from time
Yes,
to time,
indeed.
I displayed them on the screen, so users can and all the audience can see that. Thank you very much. I believe I will just touch base again regarding that licensing that you mentioned about Copilot. As you said, you can start with a free trial license, but later on, you have to convert that to a paid license. Is that correct?
That's correct. Again, that's a difference where GitHub does their own thing. Microsoft doesn't do that. If you sign up for an Azure free account,
Mm-hmm.
your subscription will not auto convert. And I love that confidence that gives the
Right.
customer or the user.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, other than there's a positive feedback here. Thank you. It's a great hour to be here. And I will just, you mentioned about Azure DevOps. I want to just
Hmm.
discuss a little bit, like when you compare Azure DevOps with GitHub Workflows and GitHub.
Hmm.
As you know, like there was this tendency that latest features and everything was arriving to the GitHub, right? To the
Right.
actions like scanning and security related
Hmm.
stuff that were on top. However, what I experienced so far with some customers, if somebody needs to have this, tight integration of security and roles like AD, it can be Windows AD, not even, I'm not talking about Azure AD yet, and Azure AD, then uh, due to my knowledge, and I may not know everything as you are about GitHub, GitHub Actions and GitHub overall system enterprise, does it have a good integration with Windows AD or Azure AD in terms of using those principles, have more secure kind of control over it? Can you just a little bit unwrap that for our audience?
Yeah, very much so. Thanks for that call out about single sign on, because that definitely has been a priority for GitHub for a long, long time, particularly when you're using the enterprise cloud license. In fact, you have to use GitHub Enterprise to unlock all of the single sign on flows. But that's where you can do your tight integration with Entra ID and the Azure cloud or local Active Directory. Yeah, there's really good support there. As far as the GitHub Azure DevOps thing, yeah, it's tough because GitHub
Yes.
has come so far. It's come so far, but it still has so far more to go. I find that with customers that I work with, they're forced into like a Bitbucket, Octopus, where you're stitching together. And I'm seeing a trend of less of that as GitHub grows,
Mm-hmm.
which is convenient and nice. But man, if you're a team that's ready to get going with DevOps right now, and you want to do your sprint management and your work management and have everybody all in the same place, there's nothing like ADO, Azure
Mm-hmm.
DevOps. It's all there and it works so beautifully together. And you absolutely can call out of Azure DevOps to GitHub, and you can call from GitHub to Azure DevOps. But Azure DevOps is a pretty nice, cohesive set of tools, no doubt.
Yes, and it's still there. I just want to kind
Hmm.
of mention to the audience that certain workflows, like if you are working with Microsoft Fabric, you want to try to do the workflows and everything,
Hmm.
based on information that I have, it's much better integrated with Azure DevOps because of those security controls and everything that you want to see when you're accessing data or your pipelines are processing that.
Well,
Is that
I'm a,
correct? I mean,
I'm
what
going to
was your
push
experience?
back on that a little bit. It
Yeah.
depends. It's one of
Yeah.
those consultants answer where it depends.
Mm-hmm.
If the business has GitHub Enterprise Cloud, then I don't see any blocker where you couldn't layer in with, say, Entra ID. And to your point, you've got multi-factor authentication, conditional access, all of those tools at your disposal. That's absolutely true. Um, as an individual, that's going to be tougher to get that integration. Yeah.
Yes.
So I can see your point there. Yeah.
Yeah. But other than that, like as you said, especially for new starters and for the
Hmm.
organization that doesn't have that, I would say, a requirement for single sign-on authentication and all those things. Uh, Starting with GitHub, and another thing that I want to mention about licensing, Tim, while we
Hmm.
are on this topic, if I remember correct, if your organization have just 5 people, you can sign up with Azure DevOps and you would not pay any single license. But when you
Hmm.
add another 6 person, then you have to pay for the license.
Yep.
So that's another, I believe, kind of, I wouldn't say selling point in Azure DevOps, but because it has been there for a while. But
Hmm.
with GitHub's workflow and everything, once you convert that to for organization, basically you want to pay, you will start from the person one per month to pay for that services. That's another kind of licensing thing that came from the customers, just to make sure audience is aware. But other than that, thank you very much for the session.
Hmm.
Everybody enjoyed it, and back to you for closing.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for participation. It's so great being here. I guess I'll say one more thing about Azure DevOps, and that is, in my opinion, its biggest weakness is its age. For example, although you can make your pipelines in YAML, and you absolutely should in Azure DevOps, it was built before YAML. So it defaults to a classic graphical editor for your build and release pipelines. And that's going to hold you back because they're not portable. Talk about a walled garden. In order
Hmm.
to make your workflows portable to the point where you could take a pipeline out of Azure DevOps and refactor it into a workflow or vice versa, you're going to need YAML for that. So be aware that when you get into Azure DevOps, I would suggest you ignore the classic environment and get right into the YAML. That's what Microsoft does internally.
Yes, definitely. That's great tip. Again, thank you everyone for being in this session. We are very glad to all the interactions that we see there. There's a lot of thank you notes for this great session. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you, Tim, being here for with us.
Thank
Thank you.